Our first presentation of the day is another great one from Marie Lyons of Atlas Systems on configuring your ArchivesSpace implementation. In this session, Marie will highlight ways you can configure your ArchivesSpace implementation from within the ArchivesSpace staff user interface. Marie will highlight configuration options for features like repository and user preferences, templates, default values, the rapid data entry tool, manage and control vocabularies, user-defined fields, tooltip editing, and data tips for using the ArchivesSpace import templates. While we will be holding all questions until the end, please feel free to drop your question for Marie into the chat at any time and during the presentation, and I will read it aloud during the Q&A. Marie Lyons is a training and library solutions consultant at Atlas Systems. She's been with Atlas for 10 years and works with special collections and archives customers on their ArchivesSpace and Aeon implementations. Prior to working at Atlas, she was a digital initiatives consultant for special collections and archives in Denver, Colorado, a cataloger at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., and a part-time librarian in the NPR Library. Welcome, Marie.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, well, welcome to configuring your ArchivesSpace implementation. Jessica already introduced me, so I'll move on. This presentation is going to be a grab bag of selected configurations, advice, some things to be aware of as you go about your ArchivesSpace implementation. These are the topics I'm going to be covering. It is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'll mainly be discussing configurations that don't require plugins. So these are changes that you can make to the ArchivesSpace system with the included files. There are a few exceptions I will point out along the way where there might be some plugins you would want to consider using based on how you're planning to use ArchivesSpace. Many of the configurations I will cover can be made using your staff interface. There are some changes specifically with the PUI customizations where you would make those changes to the server files, but they're fairly simple and I'm going to show you how to do them. And then I'll end the presentation with some other resources to get you started in the right direction depending on what you want to do for your implementation. This PowerPoint presentation is very utilitarian. I've included the text and screenshots for everything I'm going to show you, and you'll have access to those slides after the forum is completed. For this presentation, I'm going to just head out to my ArchivesSpace system and show you where these things are in real time. Two things to keep in mind. I created the presentation using versions 2.7.0 and 2.7.1. Your mileage may vary in previous versions. There's some things that I know are buggy, and I'll mention the ones that I do know in previous versions. You might also see some different fields on my screen than you will see in previous versions. I'm also logged into the staff interface as a system administrator. So if you're on your own trying to follow along in your ArchivesSpace system and you're not seeing some of the menu options that I'm showing, it could be because you have a different level of permissions. All right, so I'm going to head out of this presentation slide and go on to my ArchivesSpace system and log in with my account. And the first thing I wanted to point out to you, you'll have to set up a repository record, and that repository record's going to provide the contact info for your records. Just a few fields I wanted to make you aware of. One is the publish field. And what some libraries do when they are getting started with ArchivesSpace is they might leave their repository record unpublished while they are adding in their materials. And what that does is it prevents the repository from being available on the public interface. So if I come here and my repository is not published, I won't see it listed here. I also won't see any collections, digital materials. Unprocessed material are the accession records or record groups, which are classifications. but you could see subjects and any published agent records. So I just want you to be aware of that. If that's your strategy to keep your repository record unpublished while you're working on your implementation, be aware that subjects and agents could be appearing on the public user interface. I have a resource for you at the end of the session that will show you if you want to turn off your public interface completely until you're ready to open it up to your patrons. That's an even better option. The other thing I want to point out in the repository record is this branding image URL. You'll notice I have a link in here, and it goes to a logo here. You'll see that that logo is different from the one that I actually have in my, I just want to check something. I see some chat messages. Okay, you'll see that that logo's different from the one that I have here. So I wanted to show you what this affects. So if you do indeed put a URL there to a logo, you're going to see it in two places. One is on the staff side. If you go to one of your resource records and you click on the export button to print a PDF of your finding aid, that'll bring you to your background jobs page. We'll give it a second to run through and give us our file. When I download that PDF and open it up, that's going to be one of the places that I see that logo. So that's going to be on the staff side if you print your finding aid from the staff side. The second place that you'll see that branding image URL is going to be on the public interface. And that's going to be, if I click on repositories, I will see that logo next to that repository entry. I'll talk later about how you get your big branding logo on your pages, but this is where that branding image field is going to come from in your repository record. Next, I'm going to move to staff user preferences. So you'll have different staff users using their account to access the ArchivesSpace staff interface, and they will have different permissions. Some of your users might be system administrators, that's where that gets set, or you might have your users associated with a specific permission group within your repository, and that's where that's going to get set. A third option is to set preferences for your staff. And you'll notice that I'm doing that from my username menu. There are three types. I have global, repository, and user. It's the same form for each. Global would be preferences that you're setting across the board. So if you have more than one repository, the global preferences is what you're going to want to use. Repository preferences allow you to set preferences for a specific repository. And the user preferences allow individual users to set their own preferences, if they are allowed to, because depending on what permission group they belong to, they might not even see this menu. If you want to set preferences for other staff people, I find it most successful to use repository preferences. There's a couple of things you can do on this page. You can determine if suppressed records display in results. This is also a permission within specific groups. You can determine if records, when they're created using the Create menu, if they're going to have the Publish box checked by default. Pre-populate records, super important checkbox. I'll come back to this when I show you default values templates. You can also control what staff can see when they're searching on specific records. So right now, if I went and I browsed on accessions, all I see is the title field here. But I could change those preferences and I can say, well, actually I need some more info in order to find exactly what I'm looking for. And I could set those columns, save my changes. When I go back to browse my accessions, I'm going to see those new columns in there. Another thing that you can do on preferences is set standard note order. So in your resource records and digital objects, you have the ability to add notes. You can add 29 different notes. And when you add them in, they're just going to get listed in the order that the person doing description is adding them. So if you're particular about the order of the notes, if you always want to see abstract first and you have a very particular outline below that, you can set that up in preferences. Your staff person will then click on the apply standard note order, and it's going to just whip everything into the order that it's supposed to be in. When testing permissions and preferences, if you log into ArchivesSpace with a system administrator account, you will have access to the Become User feature. So if you click on that, you can type in the username of another user if you want to make sure that your preferences are sticking for them, if you want to make sure that they have the correct permissions, and then you can log on as them and you can see what they have access to. Something I will warn you about setting preferences and then using that Become User to test them is that there can be a lag between when you set the preferences and when you go to test. So my rule of thumb is to wait a good 5 minutes, because I didn't realize that first and it got really frustrating. I thought none of my preferences were keeping, and then I found that if I just waited a little longer, they were definitely there. Another important thing to know about these preferences is that your global preferences will be overwritten by anything you do in repository preferences. And your repository and global preferences will be overwritten by anything that users set for themselves. But again, you can prevent users from seeing these menus. Okay, next topic I'm going to get into is data entry consistency, so a way of being more consistent with description. ArchivesSpace has some built-in tools. One of the most valuable are the default values templates. There's one for almost every kind of record in ArchivesSpace. And the way you access that is to go to your Browse menu and choose the record that you want to work with. So if I just go to Accessions, this is where I see Edit Default Values. When I click on that, it's going to give me a brand new form, and this is where I can fill in values that we use all the time in a certain record. So for example, if for this year my identifiers are all going to start with 2020, I could enter that here, and then when someone goes to create a new accession, it's automatically going to put that value in for me. If we have a standard language statement that we use for access notes, for use restriction notes, this is the place to put it to save anyone who has to create these records from having to type it over and over and over again. The important part about this is once you set up those default templates, don't forget back in preferences, you have to make sure that the pre-populate records box is checked. That's what applies those templates. Another thing to know about those templates is they only apply when you are creating a record using the Create menu, Create form. If you're importing records, those rules are not going to apply. That's a totally separate function. In addition to the default value templates, agent records specifically have a really cool thing where besides creating default values, you can also add additional required fields other than what ArchivesSpace says you have to use. So for example, if in my person records, I want to make sure that we're always using, filling in that source field, I can check that whenever someone is going to create a new agent record, it's going to show as required for them, and they won't be able to save the record until they fill in that form. Same thing, you must make sure in preferences you have that pre-populated records box checked, and it does only apply if you're creating directly in ArchivesSpace. So if you're importing using LCNAV or getting your agents in through a data import, that is not going to apply there. It's only when creating. Another tool to help you with data entry is specifically for resources and digital objects, and this is called rapid data entry. And this is a way that you can create first create your collection level resource record, and then use rapid data entry to add all of the components to that record. So your series, your subseries, your files, etc. When I click on this rapid data entry, it gives me a spreadsheet within ArchivesSpace itself, and I can go through and fill in the fields that I need to fill in. It's pretty handy because for some of the drop-down menus, if I start filling those in and I go to add a second row, it's going to carry those values down, and a lot of times all I'm doing is putting in a new title and a new date. So it's super handy. In addition to rapid data entry, you can create a template. You can actually do more than one for rapid data entry. And that allows you to decide, first of all, what columns are available on the spreadsheet. Because for entering components, I'm definitely not going to be using all of them, and I don't want to keep scrolling to the right, so I can choose which ones are here. I can also choose to set up default values, because the default value template for resource records won't apply if you use rapid data entry. So you can create a template within rapid data entry with your default values. You can also set up default values based on sequencing. So you can say for a specific range, for the first line, I want you to start at this number, and then I want it to continue this way. And it'll actually fill in the values based on the counting that it's doing. You can also reorder columns, which is specifically wonderful for the dates section, because for some reason they're listed in a different order than they are on the create form. And then, as I mentioned, you can save these templates and load them as you need them. A couple of things I want to warn you about using rapid data entry. Make sure, first of all, that the level that you want to add your components to is highlighted when you go to click on rapid data entry. So here I've done some item level description. If I want to add additional items to this specific series, I have to make sure that that series is highlighted. Then when I click on rapid data entry, that's how I know they're going to go to the right place in the hierarchy. Another thing to be aware of with rapid data entry is that you can include different levels of description within one template. So I can add a subseries on one line, and I can do a file on another line. If you do that, though, when you go to submit, it's going to add everything in on the same hierarchical level. So what I do, if I'm going to use rapid data entry, I do my files first, or I do my series first, get those in, then I go back and I do subseries, then I go back and do one for files, etc. And this way things go into the level where they need to be. If you make a mistake, you can go into enable reorder mode and you can move things around. It's pretty labor intensive, so try to avoid making mistakes. Another thing to know about rapid data entry in 2.7.0 and 2.7.1, it works very well. However, the RDE template functionality has a bug in it. So that's just 2.7.0, 2.7.1. It's already been fixed for the next version, and it works fine previous to 2.7.0. So if you wanted to make a specific template, you'll see some bugginess. An even better alternative to rapid data entry, and I'm going to bring my slideshow back over for this, is to use what's called the Harvard Excel import plugin. It is a plugin that you would have to install on your server, but it's way more robust than rapid data entry. You can add many different components at different levels of description, give it some instruction about where to plug those in the hierarchy, and everything goes in beautiful. It's a really great plugin. It's so great, it's going to be incorporated in the core code in the future. This website has the plugin. It explains how to install it. It explains how to use the plugin once you have it installed. It gives you a link to the spreadsheet and explains how to organize your data. When you have that plugin installed, you will see a new button in your resource record called Load via Spreadsheet, and that's how you'll get that information in. So that is an alternative to rapid data entry. I prefer that, but if you are in a situation where you can't have plugins installed, rapid data entry is the best place to go. All right, another thing I want to show you, you might have noticed that we have a subrecord in our different fields called user defined. And those are shared amongst resources, accessions, and our digital objects. There are 25 fields that you can use to record additional information that you're not seeing another place to do that in ArchivesSpace. You're free to use them as you wish with these current labels if you're going to remember how you repurpose something, but it would make more sense if you change the label, especially because these fields are shared among the other records. So for example, if you wanted to use your text1 field to record who accessioned something, and you would label it something like accessioned by, so that if someone was working in a resource record, they would know not to use that field. This type of change is done on the back end. So this will be something on your server. I've switched over to my ArchivesSpace files. Again, all of this is in my PowerPoint slides, so don't feel like you have to write this down. This change is made in the locales file. There is a folder. There is a file here called en.yaml, markup language. En is the language, so we're using English. I can open this with a notepad editor. The first thing I'm going to do is make a backup of this file before I change anything. So this way, if I make any mistakes, I can just go and put my original file back. Here are the user-defined fields. Anything to the left of the colon, leave it alone. That is the ArchivesSpace database field, don't touch it. But anything to the right, that's where you can change that label. So if you want to use text1 as accessioned by for your accessioned records, you can certainly do that and type it in. You save your file, restart ArchivesSpace, and the next time you log into ArchivesSpace, that label is going to be there for you. Another change that you can make, you might have noticed when you go to certain fields and you run your mouse over them, you get what's called a tooltip. The tooltip could give you a definition of the field. It could let you know if there's a DAX rule you should be considering. It can give you data examples. You can modify these tooltips. That's done in the same exact folder as where we just did the user defined. So if you scroll down in that folder, you're going to see all of the text that's used for tooltips, and you can modify that as you need. Again, you're going to want to make a copy of this file before you do anything, and then save your changes, restart ArchivesSpace, and you'll see that in your ArchivesSpace system. Okay, another thing to know about is in system, there is, in your system menu, there is a manage controlled value list. This is going to be all of the lists that have drop-down menus in your ArchivesSpace system. Some of them are very flexible. You can add new terms to them if you need to. Others are a little more under control. Typically, the ones that come in through ISO standards are the ones that you really can't create new values. But with all of them, you can make life easier for staff by setting a default value. So for example, if your country, if you most often use United States, you can go down to that value and set that as the default, and that's going to be the first thing that's listed in that drop-down menu. And then if there's other ones that you commonly use, you can actually reposition them up so that they appear further up in that drop-down menu. It's a little labor intensive if you're going to use the position marks here. You can also suppress options. That's helpful if you've used certain drop-down menus in the values in the past and you no longer want to use them, but you want to preserve that history. You can suppress them so they no longer show to staff. And if you decide to use any user-defined fields that are the controlled vocabulary, this is where you're going to set that up here with the controlled vocabulary options. All right, just going through my list on my end. I'm going to bring back over my slideshow and wanted to talk briefly about importing data. There are a number of ways that you can do that in ArchivesSpace through the background jobs, a number of different formats here that you can get that data in. This website will bring you to a listing of mappings and templates that will help you organize that data to get it imported. Just some advice with importing. Be careful about any controlled values that you're importing. If they are slightly different from what's already in those controlled value lists, you're going to get a lot of duplicates. So if you already have linear feet and you're trying to import linear underscore feet, it's going to cause issues. You're going to see a bunch bunch of linear feed options in there and you'll have to clean it up. If you're running into problems with importing, then try to do it in iterations. I always stop what I'm doing and just start with one record and see if I can get that in. If that's failing, then I literally start investigating field by field. Make sure your data is formatted correctly, make sure you're not missing required fields. If you're really in a bind, try to import or create a record by hand in ArchivesSpace and then work backwards. So if you're trying to import EAD, for example, put that resource record in and go to export and export the EAD and compare it to your own file and see what's different, what might be throwing you off in that file. Okay, PUI customizations. Because of time, I'm going to stick with my slides at this point. I see some questions coming in. So first thing to know is that you can hide some of the menu options that are available on the PUI. So for example, if I don't want unprocessed material available here because I'm not actually publishing my accession records, I can change a file on the back end to hide that. I have to do it in two places. I have to do it on the menu, and I also have to do it on the repository record. This is called a badge. So if I don't want my accessions showing up, then that's what I need to do. This change is made in a file called config.rb. It's in my config file. Always make a backup file first. And I have instructions there about finding the code. This is what it looks like here. So everything is set to false, meaning that those menu options are not hidden. So that's why I'm seeing everything here. When I go in and I say, well, actually, I want accessions to be true, I do want them to be hidden, I'm going to change false to true. The second thing I have to do is I have to remove the leading hashtag, because that is my way of alerting ArchivesSpace, hey, I want you to do something different from the default instructions that you've been using. So I'm going to remove that hashtag so that you wake up and you see this special instruction that I've added here. Now, when I go to my PUI, I no longer see that unprocessed materials, and I no longer see that in the badge. Just a little bit of warning about that. What I've noticed with specifically digital objects is that you can remove those options, but they are still available in the filter here. And I have not found a way to do that in the config file. I know you can do it via a plugin, but this one I either haven't figured it out or it's not possible. So we could, if you did have digital materials and they were published and you didn't want them available, you'd have to look into a plugin to get it out of here as a search filter, or you'd have to unpublish them until you were ready to make them public. The next one is adding your logo, and that's to the PUI specifically. And for that, you're first going to create a new directory. So you'll go back onto your server in ArchivesSpace, you'll find your plugins folder, you'll get to local in there, and then public. I had to create a new folder within public called assets, and then another folder called images, and that's where I saved my new logo file. I then went to my config file, made a backup copy of it first. And what I changed, originally the branding image is pointing to this file that comes with the system. I changed that by first removing that hashtag, because again, to alert ArchivesSpace, hey, I want you to use this instead, and then adding in where I saved that new file. And that's what works. Saving it to assets, images works. I save that file, I restart ArchivesSpace, my logo will appear on the main page. If you want to put your logo in a different place, like some people like to have it on the left instead, you'll need a plugin for that. You can make some modifications to your welcome page using the regular files that are with ArchivesSpace. This is done in another YAML file. It's different from the one where we did the user-defined and tooltips. It's one directory down. Again, make a backup copy. So it's this section here where I have title and welcome info. And on this screenshot, I have mapped out where each tag is pointing to. So those are the changes you can make without a plugin. You can call it something else. You can add additional welcome message here. You can link out. You can use regular href tags to put a email address in, to link out to another page, have it open up in another tab. You can do that there. And you can also change the rollover language when someone wants to go back to the home page. Again, always make a backup of your files before changing anything. Oh, you know, I think I forgot to mention this to you. You can increase the number of search results both on the staff side and the PUI side. So I forgot to show you on staff, and I'll go back and do that. On the PUI side, so that's where the patron is just browsing, they're only going to see 10 pages, 10 results by default. You can change that. And that's also done in the config file. This is what the language looks like from the beginning. When I change it, I take away that hashtag, and I want to increase it to 15 instead of 10, so that ArchivesSpace starts using that. I'll come back to this and show you the staff side where you can do that. You can do the same thing for staff. So back on our staff interface, when staff are browsing, by default, they're only going to see 10 results on this page, and they'll have to keep clicking through. You can change that just like you can on the PUI. That's something else that is also done in the config file. Don't forget to first to do save a backup. So I usually find that just by searching on 10, because I know that's what the limit is. So here it is, this default page size. Again, I would remove that hashtag, change this to what I wanted. Maybe I want it to be 25 on the staff side, save this file, restart ArchivesSpace. Next time I go into ArchivesSpace, I'm going to see that change there. That is just a few of the customizations you can do with those files. I want to end with other things that I think it would be important for you to know from an implementation point of view. One is learning about the API. We're going to have a presentation later today about using ArchivesSpace API. It gives you a lot more flexibility with interacting with your data outside of a web browser. And this page will explain to you how to get that set up, and then different scripts that you can use to clean up your data, make bulk changes, export your data, and get it into other programs for other uses. Another thing during implementation to think about is OAIPMH. This is allowing other systems to harvest your published ArchivesSpace records so that they show up in other search results elsewhere. Some of that is set up on the back end. This link will explain to you how to do that, and some of it's configured within the staff interface itself. There's two menus. One is within the repository record, and one is in the system menu, where you can say specifically what records you want included in that harvest. These are some other resources. The Configuring ArchivesSpace page is a really great resource to learn more about what else you can do in that config file and those YAML files that I was showing you. If you want to get fancier, if you want to do more branding and make it look like your own, look at the section about theming and plugins. That's more technical. Awesome ArchivesSpace list is a great place to go to get scripts, to learn more about plugins. And the final thing you should be thinking about is other integrations during your implementation. Do you have plans to integrate ArchivesSpace with other systems? Check out this integrations page and see what you need. All right. That is the end, and I did see some questions coming in. I'm just gonna go over to my chat.
Thank you, Emery. Would you like for me to read the questions for you so you don't have to self-mock?
That sounds good. Great. Thank you.
So Dawn asked, is there a timeline for when the Harvard plugin will become available as part of the core code? So Christine DeBella did chime in with the very good news that it's going to be in the next release, which should be within a few weeks. And Christine actually did drop into the chat the test server. So if you want to go ahead and test that out and play with that, everyone, feel free. But that will be part of core code in the next release. Question from Nancy. We've had trouble getting custom user-defined field labels to show in view mode. Are your labels showing in both view and edit?
Oh, interesting. I never noticed a difference. I would have to check that. I'm curious what version you're on.
Yeah, Nancy, maybe you can pop that into the chat.
2.6. All right, I will test it out. I can't promise I'll be able to get to it today. If I do find an issue, I will submit a JIRA ticket.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. And yeah, and I'll go ahead, and since you mentioned ticketing, I'm going to drop something into the chat in just a second. You pointed out a little thing that annoys you about not being able to hide digital objects as a drop down in the search options. If you ever notice anything in ArchivesSpace like that that you would like to change, and Anne-Marie does this all the time, this isn't really for Anne-Marie, this is for everyone's information, there is a way that you can submit a feature request, and I will drop a link there so that people can know how to do that if there are little things they'd like to change in ArchivesSpace, or big things. Vivian Lee says, I highly recommend the Harvard plugin. Absolutely. Elizabeth asked, are user-defined fields / tooltips shared by all repositories? Is there a way to define for a single repository? Great question.
They are for all repositories, but I think you could use a plugin to make them repository defined. I've never tried that, but I would imagine you can pretty much do anything with a plugin. But anyone else on the call, if you have more experience, please speak up about it.
Yeah, thanks. Another question from Nancy. Does anyone have an efficient way to reposition long controlled value lists?
I don't. That's an interesting question.
If anyone has any ideas, feel free to drop.
Oh, I'm thinking maybe the API. I don't know for sure, but that might it'd be super advanced, but maybe you could do that via the API.
All right, thanks. Moving kind of quickly because we only have 6 minutes, but so Deborah says, I'll second that. She's talking about the Harvard import tool. Yes, incredibly popular. Bill asks, what are the size limits on the logos?
That I'm not sure. I have actually, so our systems team on my end usually does that part, but when I was doing my own testing, I do remember there was one library, I did have to resize their logo, but I don't know an official size. I'm wondering if ArchivesSpace.org has a specification they recommend for logos.
Blake dropped something in the chat. Logos seem to look good about 100 by 400-ish.
Oh, great. Okay. That's good to know.
Right. Can one add additional columns of fields of choice to the results in the staff interface?
Say that again.
So the question is, can you add additional columns in your results in the staff interface?
Oh yeah, you can via a plugin. For sure you can do it. I actually remember somebody talking about it, but I don't know which plugin. It might be on the Awesome ArchivesSpace page. I know it was at like an ArchivesSpace forum like this that somebody was talking that they added additional columns there. Definitely possible, but view it through a plugin.
All right. So we have a question. If you're using a hosted service, how can you manage your PUI and your staff interfaces?
That would be up to the hosted service. I can speak for what we do when patrons request things like this. We do it for them because again, it's within the config files. If you're finding something different with your own hosting service, what you can do, again, you'd have to check with the hosting service, but anyone can download ArchivesSpace. What I'm showing you is directly on my laptop. So like these files here, they're all on my laptop. And if you wanted to, you can download your current version of ArchivesSpace, make the changes you want, and then see if your hosting service would put that on the server for you. Again, don't forget to make a backup of the original or have a backup of the original that's there. But you would have to specifically talk to your hosting service.
Thanks, yeah. There's a question about the ability to change the default in the PUI from and to or.
Oh, I've never tried that before. I wonder if I'd have to research that and see if it's available in the config.
All right, there's a lot happening in the chat. All right, Christine says that for the results columns, that's not currently available, but it's in the works. Dawn says UNC added additional columns with a local plugin. It's not on Awesome ArchivesSpace because it's bundled with a lot of other customizations. Dawn, I'd love to hear more about that. Christine says default search behavior being and in the PUI is also in the next release. You can check it out at test.archivespace.org. Is there a way to adjust column width?
Oh, I've never tried. I wonder if that would be in the CSS files? I don't know. I've never tried that before.
Another question about how the search result column customization will work. I'm sure Christine can pop something in the chat about that, but it is in the works. Oh, Jenny, I'm sorry. So from or to and, it defaults to or. All right, there's a lot of chatter in the chat. From or to and is in the next release, yeah. So several different threads happening. So everybody be sure to check the chat to see what's going on. There are no new questions that I see. If I have jumped over your question, please post it back in the chat and I will read it. But we are at time, so it is time for our next set of presentations. But of course, this conversation doesn't have to end. Please keep on posting in the chat. And I will second what Natalie just posted. That was an excellent overview, Anne-Marie. Thank you very much. It was a really
Oh, my
great
pleasure.